What does it mean as a pastor to not think that the inbreaking of the kingdom happens on Sunday morning or whenever you gather for worship, but that the inbreaking of the kingdom happens to Monday to Friday, and that Sunday is about equipping and empowering God's people to both see the inbreaking of the reign of Christ and know how their work is a means by which they participate.
Hey, thanks for checking out this video from our network. The Canadian Church Leaders Network exists to seed a hopeful future for the church in Canada. We want to come alongside pastors in Canada to serve, equip, and resource them as they in turn do the same for their communities. If you're looking to be further resourced or to connect with more church leaders across our nation who are seeking to learn and lead together, we encourage you to find us on Instagram by searching CCLN or just hit subscribe below. Thanks again for watching this video. We hope it's helpful and encouraging for you.
Well, Gordon, it is really special to be with you today. This morning, as I was getting ready for this conversation, I called a friend of this podcast, a friend of mine, Daryl Johnson. Most listeners have heard him. He's a pastor here in Vancouver and been on the podcast a number of times. I said, hey, I'm chatting with Gordon Smith. I think you know him. He goes, Gordon Smith? Do I know him? He's one of my dear friends. And I said, well, how did you guys meet? And he said, oh, well, when I was pastoring in Manila, he was leading a college in Manila. And so, Gordon, I'd love to hear, more of your story than just how you know Daryl, but how, and then I understand you did missionary time in Ecuador and you've pastored globally. I just love for people just off the top to hear a bit of your story, life and ministry.
So I grew up in Latin America. My parents were missionaries there. So speak Spanish, but came back to Canada in my late teens and did undergraduate studies, eventually went on to seminary and came back to the faith during my university years, largely through the influence of Francis Schaeffer and the cohort of writers and speakers that were part of his team, I guess the word is, I don't know. Met Joella, my wife, while I was a university student.
Where were you studying?
At the University of Regina, studying history.
Okay.
So I was a history major. So then went on to seminary and from there into pastoral ministry in Ontario, Canada.
Whereabouts in Ontario were you pastoring?
In Peterborough, Ontario.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shout out Peterborough.
So no, those were good years. And then went to the Philippines. At the time, part of a huge press movement in the late 20th century to plant churches in large urban centers around the world. So we were part of that, kind of hip, hip, hurrah, here we go. Arrived in the Philippines and realized, one, I'm not cut out to be a church planter. Secondly, there are many, many Filipinos who are more than capable and qualified to do this, much more than I am. What am I doing here? And was invited to join the faculty of a theological seminary there. At first teaching part-time, eventually joining them full-time, did my doctoral studies in the Philippines, eventually became the dean of the seminary. In fact, wow. I became the dean of the seminary right around the time that Daryl showed up. I think maybe even the same year. And we developed a friendship fairly early on in his tenure in that time, and connected often not just as the two of us, but our families as well. Our sons were best friends during those years. And then came back to Canada in the early 90s. And I was the dean of my denomination. I'm ordained with the Christian and Missionary Alliance. We have a denominational seminary, or had one, in Regina, Saskatchewan. And I came back to Canada to be the dean of that seminary, and then served there for about 7 years. And then they got a new president who was a little underwhelmed by me. This happens in our lives. These things happen, you just kind of roll with it. So one thing led to another. I left and ended up in 1998 at Regent College there in Vancouver. So served on the faculty of Regent and served as the dean for a number of years. And I continue to have a teaching fellow appointment there. So teach 2 or 3 courses a year at Regent. Very glad that I get to teach on pneumatology this summer, this spring school in May, partly because of the huge tension, it's the wrong word, huge split within my own denomination, and I think beyond, on matters of pneumatology.
What are the contentious issues within that?
The contentious issues are, what is the evidence of the work of the Spirit in our lives? So I think you have one party, you might say, that have, in my estimation, a truncated pneumatology. They've never gotten to Pentecost. And so they're Trinitarian, and they say, we believe in God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Bible. And they're biblicists. They lack a dynamic sense of the immediacy of the Spirit in the life, work, and witness of the church. And then on the other hand, there are those for whom they use the expression the manifest presence, and where pneumatology is all about an experience of the ethereal other. And so then liturgy and worship is all about creating this ambiance, this notion of the ethereal other. Neither of these, in my estimation, is Trinitarian. And therefore, what I do is try to recover a sense in which the only way forward is to recover a richly nuanced Trinitarian theology and worship. And on that score, deeply influenced by Daryl Johnson. He and I have talked about these things as long as we've known each other, talked about what does it mean to have a pneumatology that is Christocentric, a Christological pneumatology, an experience of Christ experience of the Spirit that draws us into fellowship with the risen and ascended Lord. So that, I think, kind of summarizes the debate. And I don't know, I hope that indeed I can contribute. I've written a book on the subject, and I hope that the course that I teach at Regent can contribute to really clarifying what we mean by, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the great line in the Creed, the Lord and giver of life. Just what does that mean? And I teach a course on discernment, in which I contend that it is possible for us to live in an immediate responsiveness to the grace of the Spirit in our lives. So even around some of the things that you and I have chatted about, I want us to be able to answer courageously the question, what is the Spirit up to in our day? And what does it mean for us to respond missionally to that? So it's a twofold question, both internally for myself, how is the Spirit calling me to be present to this time and to this place? But then also, I'm weary of the propensity of churches to what I call, at least, franchise. That is, we're all going to go down to Willow Creek or Saddleback, and we're going to adopt a Willow Creek model for our church, wherever that's located. I think that it behooves us to instead ask, how can we learn from others, for sure, but how is the Spirit calling us to be the church in this time and in this place, and to give local congregations the skills or the competencies to do that, to discern collectively how the Spirit is calling us to be what we are called to be in this time and in this place. And frankly, I believe that for the university that I head up. What does it mean to be Ambrose University and Seminary in this city with this kind of an ecclesial affiliation, given the kinds of students that we are called to connect with in a post-Christian secular age? What does Christian higher education look like? So it seems to me we should always be asking that question. What does it mean to be the church in a time of a pandemic? Rather than being overwhelmed by this, is there a way in which we can discern how the Spirit is calling the church to be the church in such a time as this? And of course we can, but my fear is that the whole franchising model kind of created this kind of, we don't need to do our own homework. We don't have to do our own due diligence. What I want to do is empower pastors and churches to say, no, I'm pastoring on this street corner in this part of Vancouver. Across the street from me is a Lutheran church. Kitty corner from me is a Baptist church. Great. And the three of us can actually discern differently. Even though we're in the same neighborhood, we can say, this is what it means to be, name your own kind of denomination, this kind of a church in this time and in this place. The Baptist church across the street or the Lutheran church, kitty corner from me, may actually discern differently, and that's fine, as long as these are complementary and not competitive. How can we be what God has called us to be in this time and place?
If you were coaching me, I'm a pastor here in Vancouver, and you were to invite me into some practices to practice that kind of discernment, to grow in a sense of calling to place, identity and missional approach in place. What kind of practices or steps might you encourage a pastor like myself? I'm 2 years into our journey. I pastor with a team, and we're serious about reaching the city. What are some of the practices, rhythms, steps I can take to practice that kind of discernment that you're speaking of?
Well, I'm going to say two things. One is you need to walk. You need to walk the neighborhood. There's just no avoiding. And you need to walk the neighborhood and ask the question, what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? And that requires attentiveness. And I'm aware of the language. I'm trying to think where it comes from, that we live in an age of distraction, where we lack the capacity for settledness and stillness. So to cultivate attentiveness, but when I say walk it, I mean get out of your car, literally on your feet, and walk it. And by the way, I happen to believe that all the key indicators of the Spirit's presence in your neighborhood are found at the coffee shops. That is the true sacramental beverage. And so that's where you want to show up. What's happening? Who's at the coffee shops? Who's there? And what role do they have in your neighborhood? Most coffee shops do this particularly well. I say that somewhat facetiously, somewhat tongue in cheek, but not the part about walking the neighborhood. Yeah. There's just no avoiding that. You've got to be on the ground. And I do this every city that I go to. I walk it, regardless of what role I'm being called. I just now, before I got on with you, was back and forth with a colleague in Romania, and they often tease me that I know their cities so well. You're right. I've walked Bucharest. I've walked the entire downtown core. I have a really good feel for the city, and I urge them to do the same. So one is attentiveness. Secondly, we live, as Henry Nouwen has put it, in a culture of fear. And so we need to cultivate courage, because what will keep us from doing what the Spirit of God is calling us to do is fear. So if we live with if we're not able to identify what's happening to us emotionally, we're going to be overwhelmed by either anger or fear or both. So what are the fears that percolate around your consciousness? Men and women who are pastorally aware are emotionally aware. They're able to respond. They're able to identify what it is that might keep them from being all that they're called to be. So Henry Nouwen speaks about the fact that our fears will never ultimately be gone. All we can do is ask them to sit over in the corner, and when they try to come out of the corner, get a stick out and beat on them and tell them to stay where they belong. That's his more violent way of doing what I prefer, and that is that astute pastors are able to bracket out their fears. That is to know that the decisions and choices they are making are not rooted in fear. So yes, I have my fears, but am I able to act in a way that is actually congruent with what Paul calls Timothy to in 2 Timothy 1:6-7, fan into flame the gift of God, for God has not given us a spirit of timidity or fear or anxiety, but a spirit of love, power, and self-control. So cultivating attentiveness and cultivating courage, I think, are rather crucial.
This might transition a little bit into the work that you've done around pastoring in secular Canada and articulating some of the work. I know that's informed by some of what Charles Taylor has done, but I know for me, part of my fear, if I'm honest, is I'm just so keenly aware of how confrontational some Christian doctrine is in the midst of a culture like Vancouver, probably same in most cities across Canada. And it's not obviously every point, but that's a real fear I'm wrestling with, Gordon, is just like, and I'm just naming it. I hope I don't live out of it. I don't think I'm making a decision, but I'm naming it. I want to be liked by my neighbors. I want to be liked by the city. I don't want to be picketed on Sunday morning. And I'd love to know, Gordon, like, as you processed some of the cultural shifts, how that changes what it means, not just to make disciples, but to pastor courageously in a world where 50 years ago, some of the core ethical questions of Christianity were assumed on a cultural level. However, the core claim that Jesus is Lord is always confrontational. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, hasn't changed. However, the tone has changed in the dialogue of how it's interacting on a cultural level. And I just wonder, what kind of reflections you might have on that experience as a pastor, feeling that resistance against culture that's sometimes right in your church.
Yeah, I would just observe that perhaps it's not so much the fear of failure in that case, but the fear of being shamed or rejected, that what I have to offer is rejected, not welcomed. And I think we need to just learn to live with that. So I sometimes jokingly say, but there's actually deep truth in it. I can't do my job unless I know I'm loved. And ultimately it's loved by the Father. But I lean into the love of friends and the love of spouse and the love of my granddaughters. I have 2 granddaughters who think I'm awesome. You may think that you may be a little underwhelmed, but if you met my granddaughters, you'd be immediately impressed. They're young women of extraordinarily good judgment. And so I lean into that judgment. That is, I find my ego needs met somewhere else than in the engagement with my neighborhood or my culture. And you have to tend to those ego needs. You cannot survive without knowing that you are loved to the depth and core of your being. And ideally, that is ultimately the love of the Father, mediated to you through Christ, through the grace of the Holy Spirit. But there's no avoiding that it's going to be mediated to you through the grace of friendship, marriage, family, wherever and however that finds expression. And I think what that does then is it gives us hopefully the courage to build bridges rather than build walls, to find points of connection rather than find points of disconnection. So frequently our engagement with our world is the points of difference rather than the points of commonality. So we're so aware during Ramadan how different our Muslim neighbors are. Develop a friendship with your Muslim neighbors and you find out that they're wrestling with some of the same things you are, trying to raise teenage girls or teenage males. And some of the same longings and aspirations are theirs as that are ours. But building rapport is crucial. Finding common ground is crucial. And I think we assume when our posture is to first, what are the points of disconnect with our culture and our society? Those will come up, but I'm just wondering whether that should be where we start. Let's start with where we have common ground. So I work in higher education in this province. There are 9 universities in Alberta. We get together as the 9 presidents of these universities, and they include University of Alberta with 38,000 students, and our little house here with 1,000 students. And we're all in the room together. And we were on a retreat together 3 weeks ago, and we were talking about core values of higher education. It was a very stimulating conversation because I think everybody in the room was kind of surprised at how much we agree on these are the core values. These are the deep commitments we have for our students, regardless of large university or small.
We've been doing this exercise as a staff at the church that I think it's like a thought exercise that I feel like could be really key to discipleship. And the idea is you articulate maybe a current issue in the city or current thing happening in culture. And you try to articulate 3 things. First, what does Christianity affirm about this? Like what's good and true and beautiful in what's happening? And then the second movement is, what might the truth of God's word, the story of God in human history critique about this? What might it push up against? And then lastly, how do we articulate an alternative way, a redemptive alternative way in the context of God's story. And what I'm hearing and what you're articulating is an emphasis on a redemptive approach, like looking for what can be most redeemed and celebrated within the context of culture as a starting point, not as necessarily the finish line, but a starting point. And my hunch is, because you're so thoughtful and you've worked out this stuff, I just love kind of selfishly to hear you talk more about working through a redemptive approach to culture and even processing some of the conversations happening at a meta level in culture with that redemptive first, that bridge building first mentality. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your approach there.
When I say walk the neighborhood, part of what I'm saying is you're listening as well. When I refer to coffee shops, you're listening to conversations. What are people longing for? What are their aspirations? What is it that matters to them? What is it that makes them angry? What is it that makes them afraid?
One thing I also was really keen to chat about with you was just building on the same conversation. You did a book in 2020, or was released in 2020, called Wisdom from Babylon, Leadership for the Church in a Secular Age. And I'd just love to hear, just give us a taste of some of the convictions that you form that we can learn leadership in a secular age from the journey in Babylon, and kind of some of the values you espouse that might serve pastors today.
Well, I think there's no doubt that book is written against the backdrop of a church that assumes that we have a privileged voice within our society. And that is long gone. That is.
Talk to me more about that. Talk about that shift. And we'll just park here for a little while, because I think that's a
Sure.
really important shift, because I think that sometimes there could be in one church, elders, board members who don't know the shifts happen.
Right.
And then young leaders who are like, we're talking about, and so good people who love each other feel like they're talking about different worlds and missing each
Right.
other. So can you talk more about that shift? And we'll park here for a while so we can dive deep.
So fair enough. So I do think it's important for us to tell the story about what has happened to our society and our culture. So in Wisdom from Babylon, I go back to the 1960s, and I agree with both historians, philosophers, and sociologists who recognize that, at least in the West, the 1960s were a pivotal decade. We're telling a story about what has happened in our country. And we're not trying to tell it in a judgmental way. We're just describing reality. I think, so there's a song that gets sung in, I roll my eyes at this song. And it thy kingdom come, and it has this line in it, we're going to win our nation back. The problem with the line is it assumes we lost it. So when I say tell the story, it's not to tell the story of gain or loss. It's just to describe the new reality in which we live. But it has to be described in a way that is hopeful, that is not despairing. So I'm a big fan of Søren Kierkegaard. It was Kierkegaard who was saying 150 years ago plus that maybe it's not a good thing when the church has a privileged role within the society, either architecturally in the big steeple downtown, or in the way that its voice is privileged in the courts, or in the legislature, or in the schools. Those are the three big battlegrounds, typically. At least they are here in North America. So the huge debate about the Supreme Court in the United States, and then now the huge debate about what happens in education in Florida. This is typical. One of the things we need to be doing is preaching the exile from the Old Testament prophets. This has been more relevant than ever. So when I was a seminary student, we focused on the Gospels and Paul, very, very little on the Old Testament prophets. It was, in a sense, an indication that we didn't see how relevant they were. There's no part of the scripture that's more relevant now. We've got to be preaching Daniel and Jeremiah, so that there's a sense in which, being the exile people, this is okay.
Right.
And Jeremiah and Daniel, especially Jeremiah, but that this is manageable. This is not crushing or alien or foreign. I also think we need to be telling the story of the church that has historically always been a minority presence. So no doubt my own experience has been deeply shaped by being in and out of Lebanon, meeting with brothers and sisters there who live in a country where for centuries they've been a minority presence, and the church has thrived there. So telling the stories of churches that have thrived as a minority presence, I think can be a source of encouragement to us. And then obviously much of my teaching takes me back to the early church, the pre-Christendom church, to say Augustine, Ambrose, Gregory of Nyssa, these voices are more crucial than ever, so that I don't teach a course at Regent, for example, or anywhere where I don't draw on the wisdom of the early church, because I think there's wisdom there for now that like never before.
Wow.
So telling the story of our own culture, but not in a way that despairs that something's gone wrong, just describe the new reality. And to say, yeah, it's a change, and we don't like change, fair enough, but let's not panic. Let's just say, okay, what's happened, and what does it mean, and what opportunities present itself for the church to thrive that wasn't there before. That is, I'm going to be so bold as to say, secularity, and this is Kierkegaard, so it's nothing original to me. Secularity is actually a gift. It's not a problem. It's an opportunity. Same thing with pluralism. The fact that our country is religiously plural is not a problem. It's an opportunity. So if we can start resetting the issues that are before us to say, only then I think will we have both the creativity and the courage to be what we are called to be in this time and in this place.
I feel so deeply about the importance of this conversation. I love that language of the creativity and the courage. I think what's interesting is to also name the story that we're experiencing, which is many, and I don't want to generalize too much, but for the sake of the conversation, many of our modes of church, like our best practices, you cited different sources of church models, were birthed and formed and successful in the context of a Christendom, a modern Christendom within the Western culture. And so what we're feeling is, as let's just say the church has fallen out of favor with the culture, as a way to put it, is these models were almost like, well, this is all we know. And so when you mentioned sourcing Lebanon, sourcing the early church, sourcing the first century church that spread across Rome, that's better source material for finding discipleship models. Now, obviously, there's also a need for the Spirit to lead, because we need to figure out how to do this in the digital context, which is entirely new, and these other elements. But there's a sense by which we need to name that many of our modes and models were birthed in an era we're no longer in.
And so, but we can't do the rethinking unless we get greater clarity about what it means to be the church. So ecclesiology is more important than ever. And when you use the word church, and when I use the word church, what is the range of associations we have with that word? And so one denomination here in Canada is in major debate about whether a person can be a member of the church if they disagree on matters of human sexuality. And I'm thinking, what is your notion of membership? What does this mean? But that would be an example of what you were just referred to, is so you become a member of the church, like you become a member of the Lions Club, like you become a member of a golf club, I guess. And really, that's the model we're using for what it means to be a participant in congregational life. I think what's going to come out of this is we're going to have a much keener sense of the church as a movement rather than as a club that you join like a member. And so that being a participant in congregational life is going to look very different than it has to, than being something that's defined by the benchmark or the boundary of, are you a member of this church? And therefore you can vote at the AGM, whoever wants to go to the AGM anyway. But I think that's an example of where some deep change needs to happen, is we rethink, what does it mean to be a participant, a responsible participant in congregational life? But that's just one. But if we're not clear about what we mean to be the church, we're not going to be able to navigate this, because your point is spot on. We have a whole range of assumptions about what it means to be the church that go with a Christendom model. Now Yikes. Are we going to give up membership? Like that's one of the givens. And so if that's the case, how are we going to describe, what does it mean to be the church? And what does it mean to be a responsible participant in the life of the church?
One of the ongoing conversations we've been having on this podcast, it's deeply connected, and it sounds so funny to ask this question because we're dedicated to pastors, but even like defining the pastoral vocation. So if there's a crisis of ecclesiology, I think there's also a crisis of defining like a consistent ecclesiology. There's a crisis of defining the pastoral vocation.
Yeah.
What does this mean? And again, when I want to save my commentary for another time, but there's that crisis. And then similar, I think, is how do you make a disciple, or what is a disciple of Jesus? And it sounds like I'm not just trying to be like Socratic and go to these questions, but I think these are this is the wrestling that we've kind of been able to do the work of church without asking the fundamental evaluative question of like, what are we doing? What does it mean to be a pastor within this context? And how would we know if we were making disciples or not?
Yeah. Well, no, well said, because in both cases, they're derivative of our ecclesiology. So what does the pastoral vocation? We make a whole range of assumptions about what that looks like, how one invests time and energy. What are the indicators of fruitful and effective pastoral leadership? And they will flow directly from what we understand the church to mean. So an example of that for me would be that I think a course on preaching is not ultimately about technique and oratory. It's ultimately about meaning. What do we mean by this practice in the life of the church? But we're so obsessed with oratory and method. So I'm battling the phenomenon known as competency-based education. And I want to say, no, you're asking the wrong question. Is this person competent as a preacher? I want to say, no, do they understand the meaning of this act of preaching? What does it mean? And what it means, of course, is ultimately going to be directly related to your point about what it means to be the church. So we're asking meaning questions like never before, have to. And yes, we're going to be asking questions about what it means. What does the Christian life look like? And I think we're going to be shifting metaphors. So the metaphor that has dominated my way of thinking about the Christian life is the metaphor of infancy and adulthood. So I published a whole book called To Be Saints, and it's subtitled An Invitation to Christian Maturity. I mean, there's just no avoiding that this baby boomer, that's how I think about the Christian life, from infancy to adulthood, and you're going to grow in wisdom. And Smith is an example of somebody who has beat this drum. But increasingly, I'm finding that most of the people that I serve, it's not necessarily a metaphor that resonates with them. For them, consistently, two other metaphors are front and center. One is the metaphor of pilgrimage or journey. Look how popular the Camino de Santiago de Compostela is. Well, that's in part reflection of the sense of that the Christian life is a journey, that we're pilgrims. And of course, it's an ancient metaphor. It dominates the Psalms, the Gospel of Luke. That's the metaphor of the Gospel of Luke. We're followers of Jesus. So it's not that we just discovered this. It's just that we've kind of defaulted to metaphors that may not be as resonant. And another metaphor, I think, is the metaphor of healing and wholeness. And that is that for so many people, they've given up on the Christian life because of an addiction or a trauma that they feel keeps them from being what they're called to be. And I think so many of our approaches to discipleship assume that you can kind of pull your life together. And in actual fact, I can't. We need to learn from Alcoholics Anonymous, frankly. They actually have some wisdom there that we might learn from. That if I'm addicted and broken and traumatized, I need a way forward that doesn't assume that I can get my act together.
I'd love to chat with you before we finish about calling. And maybe I'll just stitch together 2 points of reference. One was you had a moment where you realized maybe I'm not going to pastor in the way you expected. And then it seems like God did this really cool thing in your story of like through education and through, you found this other way to build a church with your unique gifts and callings. And I know that you've done work. You published a book called Courage and Calling. And I think that there's a lot of questions, at least for my peers in the church, asking like, what does it mean to know if I'm called to be a pastor? Can I have assurance of my call? How do I work that out? And then also as we pastor, I feel like this is one of the number one questions I'm wrestling with young disciples is how do I discover why I'm here on planet Earth and my unique contribution? So I just love just to open the floor for you to share some of what you've learned and about discovering and helping people discover calling.
Yes, without doubt. Probably in my speaking and preaching, the book Courage and Calling has been very well received. And I have actually a book coming out later this year entitled Your Calling Here and Now. And there the focus is at this time and in this place. Jason, it's actually every day. Every day I want to know, and it's not an unreasonable aspiration and longing. At this time and in this place, how am I called to speak and how am I called to act? That's a reasonable question. And what am I called to not say? And what am I called to not do? I don't have to be a frenetic, busy person. I can graciously accept this is what's been given to me to do. And may God give me the courage to do it, to say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done at any given time. It's every day. So yes, I know we often use the language of vocation. What's your job or occupation? I want to bring it right down to the immediate. At this time and in this place. On any given day, there's more to do in this job as the president of university than one person could possibly do. And I don't need to be I don't need to be a hero or a messiah. I can just, at this time and in this place, what am I called to say and what am I called to do? And then to trust that God will do God's work in God's time with whatever contribution I bring to the table. It actually is liberating, but it gives focus and meaning and purpose. We can't get here, though, unless we appreciate that there's good in, we have to get past the idea that there is a higher calling or a more sacred calling, so that the calling to the mundane, the ordinary, to is just as crucial as anything heroic we might do. That's the one example of it. But my Asian, Canadian, Asian American friends, they live within a religious and social subculture that is huge pressure that their children would go into medicine, engineering, or law, and that they bring shame on the family if they don't do one of those three. And that's what their pressure point is to bring honor to the family by the kind of prestige that goes with their job. That is just odious, and it's oppressive. So can we do more preaching and teaching that actually provides a biblical theology of work, vocation, so that we understand that work is the work is good, and that the ordinary is fine. That's a start. Secondly, I do think, you alluded to it, maybe you didn't do so intentionally, we need to actually give greater liberty to what I've spoken of as mid-career transitions. That is, I think an increasing number of people are going to be making significant career transitions in midlife. So people who are going to go into the arts. So in my book, I quote a book entitled Old While at Art School. And it's a senior citizen. She decided to go to art school and become an artist. And she decided this in her 60s. I think this is going to be happening more and more. And it's actually quite exciting because some of the most significant work that is done by people who came into the role, not in some jobs, you can't be a ballerina. You can't decide in your 40s, I'm going to be a ballerina. I'm sorry, that train has left the station. It's gone. Let it go. But many, so for example, here at Ambrose Seminary, The majority of our students in the seminary are mid-career transition people, not like what I was. Out of university, I felt a call to ministry. I went to seminary. I became a pastor. 100% of my peers in seminary in the 1970s were in the same category. We'd done our undergraduate in a public university. We went to seminary. We went into pastoral ministry. That is now the exception. The norm now is mid-career transitions. And can we empower people to do that, to see where indeed they're called, to take early retirement as a public school teacher and become a pastor, or go into business, or go into the arts, whatever it happens to be. More and more of that's going to be happening. And it's exciting. I mean, right now, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the successor to Rowan Williams, Justin Welby, he was in business with Total in France, called into ministry, went to Durham, did his seminary education, became an Anglican priest, became a bishop, and now is the Archbishop. That is, somebody as prominent as that discovered his calling to religious leadership out of business. So what does it mean as a pastor to two things? One, to not think that the inbreaking of the kingdom happens on Sunday morning or whenever you gather for worship, but that the inbreaking of the kingdom happens to Monday to Friday. And that Sunday is about equipping and empowering God's people to both see the inbreaking of the reign of Christ and know how their work is a means by which they participate. That is, it's a meaning-making exercise. Preaching is equipping and empowering people to appreciate the meaning of the kingdom and how their work is a participation in what God is doing in the world. It's fabulous. And therefore, we judge a congregation not by its size, for goodness sakes, but by whether or not the members of that congregation are being equipped and empowered to be all that they are called to be Monday through Friday. And probably mega churches are least able to do this. That is, they are least equipped to do this. I think the odds are it's going to be smaller congregations who are more effective in the long run, precisely because they have pastors who know the congregational members and preach in a way. So when you get up to preach, you can imagine the pharmacist, the school teacher, the artist, because I was in her gallery last week. The pharmacist, I picked up my own meds for my daughter in that very pharmacy last week. I can picture her there. The school teacher, I visited that school teacher in his school, teaching grade 5 boys, for goodness sakes. And I'm going to preach in a way that empowers and encourages him to do exactly that.
Wow.
And have that imagination, but then also to equip, to preach in such a way that frees people to let go when it's not their calling anymore. That is, I can leave teaching public school without guilt, without a feeling of failure, and embrace a new thing that God is calling me to. And it may be pastoral ministry, or it may be to go into business with my cousin, whatever it happens to be. That is one of the great gifts I think we can give to people through the ministry of the word is meaning making about their lives and their work. And if they don't think of their work as important and significant, they will not think of their own lives as important and significant. So for all of us, whether we like it or not, I mean, we make jokes about, don't ask me what I do, ask me who I am. Fair enough, except that you're not going to get away from it. That their work gives them a sense of meaning and purpose in life, whether it's homemaking and raising children, or as an artist, or as a business person, whatever it happens to be. And I think as pastors, we are positioned so well to assure people of the significance and meaning of their work, especially in a society that denigrates the people who wait on tables, clean up after us in hotels, remove the sanitation workers who remove, or the auto mechanic who does not think of his work as meaningful as the lawyer. Those of us that are pastors are routinely telling people, your work matters. It matters to me, and it matters to God. And there's just so I think we should be doing this all the time.
Beautiful. Really practical. question. Somebody's listening right now and they're like, hey, I want to follow this thread. I want to preach better into people seeing meaning in their vocation, a better theology of work. And what are some books that have helped impact you, books or thinkers or voices? Because I just want to let people follow that thread. Who's helped shape this most for you? And what kind of books might you recommend on this subject?
Well, anything that Darrell Johnson has written on the kingdom is helpful. That is, Darrell is a key voice, I think, for many of us in reminding us that this is our primary point of reference, that what is happening on Sunday morning is we're preaching the kingdom, but you better have a comprehensive understanding of what we mean by the reign of Christ. And if you don't, then you're not going to be able to do this. Anything on that topic? What else can I talk about?
Who articulates work well? Because I agree with you, Willard, Darrell, others, the kingdom. Who's done a great treatment on work? Like that would help us preach to the mechanic, the man or woman who's home with children, whoever it might be, to say, this matters. And here's how we see this playing through scripture. And here's how we can articulate that better and better. Or is it just courage and calling? Maybe I set you up poorly. You don't want to, you're too Canadian to be like, well, you could read my, I'll do that for you. I'll recommend that.
In Courage and Calling, I have a chapter on the calling to business, the arts, and education. And in each case, I identify, I think it's going to be vocation specific. Mm-hmm. So who are the really fine writers on the vocation of the artist out there? And the calling to teach. I mean, frankly, Parker Palmer's book, The Courage to Teach, all teachers read that book and all teachers realize, yeah, that's me or it's not. South of the border there, SPU, Seattle Pacific University, Alex Hill, I think, has done superb work on the calling to business. And by the way, that's as important as anything, because I think you don't really get a biblical theology of work until you recognize the significance of business, the production of goods and services, because so frequently we think of that as low-grade work, not important, not meaningful work in the life of the church. It's just about money and making money. And until we kind of articulate a theology of business as a vocation, the production of goods and services. So Alec Hill, that's who we've had here on campus. I want all of our business students to hear him or hear variations of that so that they know that the calling to business matters. But we're all doing this all the time. I mean, I'm looking over the screen here and I can see where the building is that has our education program. And that's where the school teachers that are going to go into public schools. And Jason, every year I get to go over there for the new students that are enrolled in the fall that anticipate that 2 years later they're going to be teaching in the public schools teaching elementary school kids in the public schools of this country. And I get to do that. That's part of my job. I can't believe I get to do it. I get to go over there and tell them, can I tell you just how crucial your work is? And I tell the story of my granddaughter and how her grade 2 teacher made such a fundamental difference in her life. Wow. So I think we need to be doing this all the time.
Beautiful.
Is celebrating the work of the diverse ways in which God is fulfilling God's kingdom purposes in the world. But part of it is affirming the ordinary and the mundane. This morning, in your house, I'm sure you have a division of labor if you have a partner. In my house, the division of labor includes two things. One, when there's a mouse in the mousetrap, I think Joella thinks that's why I got married, so that somebody else would take these out. I think sometimes she would. Why would I get married if you're not going to do that? I mean, that's one of the perks of marriage. And I take out the garbage. This is what I'm called to do. I think part of a theology of work is affirming the ordinary, the mundane, the routine, the daily rhythms, and get past the sense of I only do the heroic. although I feel pretty heroic taking out the corpse of a rat or a mouse.
Well, I can't think of a better place to end our conversation than with that picture of you encouraging future educators and taking out a mousetrap. I am very grateful for your time, Gordon. Thanks for the work you're doing at Ambrose, to raising up people in all fields. Thanks for the time you invested in us today, for being for pastors and caring. Bless you so much, man.
Thank you.
Before you go, we want to let you know about a few things we do here at CCLN that might serve you as you lead yourself and others. Firstly, we regularly release interviews with incredible church leaders from across Canada and the world on our podcast called the Canadian Church Leaders Podcast. So we encourage you to check that out wherever you listen to your podcasts. Secondly, we send out a monthly newsletter with the best resources, podcasts, books, and articles that we've put together for leadership in the Canadian context. If you want it sent straight to your inbox each month, head to ccln.ca to sign up. Lastly, we run a 2-year program called the Church Leaders Incubator, created for young pastors to strengthen their character and ministry for long-term, effective senior leadership. If you're leading a church in Canada or on a trajectory to do that one day, we would love you to consider applying this year or the next. You can learn more about it on our website. Well, thanks again for checking this out. We love you all and are cheering you on. Bye for now.